The 80s were a crazy time, and I'm not talking about the drugs. I'm talking about their massive, mega analog polysynths, specifically the MemoryMoog. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music technology related. And today we have another segment of Is It Worth It? And we're looking at the classic Moog MemoryMoog. Came out in 1982, right around the time of a bunch of mega poly analog synths. It's ironic that this was the pinnacle, the early 80s was the pinnacle of mega poly analog synths. You had the Jupiter 8, you had the Prophet 5, you had the Oberheim OBXA. There were all the most revered polyphonic, massive polyphonic analog synths were right around that time, right around the early 80s. And it's really ironic because this was also on the precipice of analog decline with the release of the DX7 and then the release of the Korg M1. This was both the height and the precipice that analog synths would fall completely off and not really return to mainstream until the last couple of years, so 2015, 16, 17. So really interesting time, really amazing instruments from this era that still fetch incredible prices used. MemoryMoogs today, if you go on Reverb, you don't find one really for under $10,000. And so the question is, are these still good investments, both musically and financially as a kind of collector item? And we're going to talk about what we think about those two different areas. So a little history on the MemoryMoog. It came out in 1982. It was a little late to the party. It was after the Jupiter 8. It was after the Prophet 5. And it was also rushed to market. It was at the end of Moog. I think Moog shortly after declared bankruptcy. Moog was struggling financially. Robert Moog was no longer part of the company. He left in the late 70s. The ownership had changed multiple times. And it was an incomplete product rushed to the market. And historically, they're known to be problematic. They're known to have reliability issues. They're known to have, especially like the power supply and a couple other. I'm trying to think of what are some other common issues, but they're pretty dicey. And fortunately, there's a Lamb upgrade that you can get that basically future-proofs your MemoryMoog, and it's very common for people to get it installed, and it basically makes it a very reliable instrument. But the ones that came out, there was only about 3,500 produced, but they're notorious for being unreliable. This one is actually number 2652, and it's interesting, the serial number is handwritten, kind of gives you this, and it's very sloppily handwritten, so it gives you this sense of kind of like, get it out the door, it's sold. And our tech here actually said that he saw so many of these in the shop at the time when they were released that he'd had to go and retrofit and fix. It's a very common thing that was seen by synth technicians from the day. So it wasn't designed by Robert Moog, but it used his classic ladder filter. It was a discreetly implemented version of it. So they did use the classic ladder filter that was patented by Moog, and probably the most famous thing associated with Moog synthesizers. What's interesting is the oscillators are chip-based oscillators. They're not discrete. So they're Curtis chip oscillators. And there's a ton of them. It's got 3 oscillators and it's 6-voice polyphony, and so it's got 18 chip Curtis oscillators inside of it, and you can put it into a monophonic mode, which gives you this massive sound. It's a massive synthesizer. Most of the other mega polysynths of that era were 2 VCOs. This one was 3 VCOs, so you got that extra multiplication of oscillator power. And so it's really a heavy-duty sound. It fills the mix completely. It's overpowering, and if you detune them slightly, it's just this massive wall of sound. So very cool, very unique tone. Really, I don't know of many other synthesizers that sound like a MemoryMoog, modern or vintage. It's got its own characteristic and its own flavor. Even the Moog 1 that Moog's released, I haven't had a chance to personally play it, but I've listened to it and heard a number of kind of reviews and summaries of it. Very interesting modernization and interpretation of the MemoryMoog, but very different. So is the MemoryMoog worth it from a sound standpoint, from a collectible standpoint? I would have to say personally, yes to both. The sound is totally unique. It's got the Moog sound, but it's 6. People often describe this as 6 Moog, mini Moogs in one, which is that would be incredibly expensive to polychain those, and it wouldn't have all the kind of modulation capabilities that this instrument itself has. So I think it's unique. I think it's interesting. It also, even if you polychain mini Moogs, it's a different sound because the oscillators are different. I think the oscillators on mini Moogs are discrete, whereas this is a chip-based oscillator. And sometimes people say that the Curtis chips have a sound that's undesirable. I think in this particular implementation, it's fantastic. The envelopes on this MemoryMoog are also incredibly fast. I was reading online from a tech who said that he couldn't believe how fast, even though these were chip-based envelopes, how fast the envelopes were on this thing. And he thinks it's some of the best implementation of envelopes in one of these massive poly analog synths. I think it's Rosen. It's a shop called Rosen's repair shop in California. They're pretty famous for repairing these kind of behemoth classic synths. So really cool piece. It was designed by a group of engineers under David Lucy, who was kind of worked closely alongside Robert Moog, and so it very much in the spirit of the Moog tradition. And it was really also, it came after I forgot what the name, I think it's the PolyMoog, which was a divide down polyphonic Moog piece. And this was, it's also kind of revered and sought after, but this is definitely way more revered and sought after. There's another version of it that's got it's a MemoryMoog Plus, and what they added was MIDI and sequencer. And some people actually think it sounds, the taxing put on the CPU on the MemoryMoog Plus because of the MIDI and the sequencer actually made it sound less kind of amazing than the original MemoryMoog synthesizer. I don't know, because I haven't played both side by side, but that's just kind of out there to be argued online. One of the other really cool features is the glide. When you use the glide function, it's got a very interesting, the way it functions and the way it sounds, it kind of it's got some imperfections in the way it goes, and in that those imperfections have added kind of a beauty to the glide. It's a very full glide sound with all the oscillators going and the way that the signal moves between the notes. It's very cool. It's kind of legendary in its own right. And this is just a great piece musically, and not only musically, but from a collector standpoint, they're fairly rare. If you get one with the Lamb mod, or you get a tech to go and basically future-proof it, I think it still holds its place and its value and its worth. And it's interesting in where it comes in analog synth history. I definitely applaud Moog for having the Moog 1, because it is the only other kind of massive polysynth that's been attempted in the modern era. No one else has attempted kind of this style of kind of the great titans of analog synthesis that came in the early 80s. So it's really cool that Moog is attempting to put these type of instruments out there. But until more manufacturers attempt to do that, really the only place to get this kind of magic, this massive polyphony and massive kind of circuitry is in vintage synthesizers like the MemoryMoog, the Jupiter 8, the Oberheims, and the CS80. Those are yet to be recreated in a modern analog format. Here's praying that someone does it, but alas, it hasn't happened yet. So let's take a listen, give you a sense. We're just going to play around with some patches, not going to go too deep into it. We haven't had that much time to kind of get super familiar with it, but we're going to try and do our best to show it off. Then we'll conclude. massive, massive. That thing is overwhelming, and I don't think the recording will probably do it justice. I mean, it rattles the room when this thing is being played. It's huge and overwhelming, but beautiful. Totally love the sound. If you ever get a chance to play one, plug it into some good speakers. It's going to overwhelm you. One last thing. I forgot to mention, I wish I would have mentioned it earlier in the video. This thing physically vibrates whatever it's on. It's like living. You can feel its energy just pulsing through it. It's like a old air conditioning unit. It is, you can feel how much power is packed in it physically. When you're playing it, it has a slight vibration. Even this table is vibrating as I'm sitting here in front of it. And it's got this massive heat sink on the back to let out the heat that's generated by all the circuitry inside. It is visceral, and it feels living and visceral, much different than any other synth I've ever played on. It's also incredibly heavy. I think it's around 50 pounds. It's massive. And inside, it's beautiful. It's totally, inside of any complex analog instrument is like a beautiful work of architecture. It's really neat. One other thing, the story behind this was in the closet of my brother-in-law's grandmother, who, her husband was a pianist, and he apparently at one point bought a MemoryMoog, and it just kind of sat in their closet forever. His granddad died. His grandmother was clearing out things and was like, "Do you want this? I'm going to throw it away." Fortunately, he took it. He asked me, "Hey, what is this?" And I was like, "Oh my God, this is a piece of history." So I wonder how many times that's happened with these instruments. You got it, 3,500 roughly were made, but how many were thrown away, especially because they were so problematic and people didn't understand how to get them fixed. It's kind of tragic, but speaks to their value as collector's items. And I hope you can hear from the demo their value as a musical kind of instrument. It's really a beautiful instrument, really a tribute to Moog's legacy and history. Probably, in my opinion, the pinnacle of early Moog instruments prior to the latest incarnation of the company. So if you have any comments, if we left something out, or you want to ask a question about this instrument, leave it below. Again, you can find us online at alamomusic.com. Leave us a comment. You can write us an email, give us a call. We'd love to talk to you more about synthesizers or other musical instruments. And thanks so much for watching. Hit subscribe if you didn't. Turn on your notifications. Let us know what we can do better and what other videos you'd like to see. Till next time.